This is the third part to your cellular respiration notes, and we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration, which is, in other words, fermentation. So again, if you do not have oxygen that will come into the electron transport chain to accept the hydrogens and the electrons that are being pumped through it, then NADH and FADH2 are going to get full, and your body or a cell only makes so many of those molecules. And so they'll get full, and it'll even stop the process of glycolysis, and it'll stop the Krebs cycle. But it also stops glycolysis, because glycolysis, you have to have fresh NADs to put the hydrogens on in order to break it into pyruvate. So if you run out of NAD and FAD, then you can't go through that process anymore. So animal cells and plant cells and fungus and bacteria have evolved this mechanism called fermentation, so that we can get rid of those hydrogens if they can't get pulled off in the electron transport chain because of lack of oxygen. We can get rid of them somewhere, and so we put them into different molecules. Now, those molecules aren't helpful to us or plants, but they, like, long term, so we still have to break them down, and it causes energy to use to do that. But they are helpful in the sense that if you need energy very quickly, we can make these molecules and break them down later, but you can still generate 2 ATP every time you go through glycolysis. So let's discuss fermentation. And according to your notes, I'll slow down a little bit. So fermentation is anaerobically extracting energy from carbohydrates using only glycolysis to generate ATP. So glycolysis is the only process out of those three that we're going to be looking at. Alcoholic fermentation, which happens in a lot of plants and bacteria, begins with glycolysis to break down glucose, and then using yeasts to produce, which is a fungus actually, it will use yeast to produce carbon dioxide. Bakers use this to get dough to rise. Fermentation of dough causes the dough to rise, which is why it kind of smells like beer when you make bread. What you're smelling is like yeast going through fermentation. So it produces carbon dioxide, and it also makes alcohol, such as wine or beer. So in my nice little picture here, I've got my baker baking my bread, and I've also got my wine off to the side. So we start with glucose. Glucose will make 2 ATP, but it also makes 2 NADH, and that would shut down the process. But through decarboxylation, where we're making our CO2 or our bread to rise, we make acetaldehyde, and then that will accept the hydrogen and turn into ethanol. And ethanol is what is in wine. And so then the NAD can be recycled again, it goes back up, and we can break down another glucose. So this just happens over and over, and you build up ethanol. Now in wine, you trap the alcohol, you keep the alcohol. In beer, you would trap also the carbon dioxide, and depending on the process and what's being used, that's how you build up your alcohol to make your different beverages. However, animals don't get to get drunk off of their fermentation. We have a different way of making it, and it's not as fun, and it creates this this burning sensation in our muscles. So it says energy for skeletal muscles is from aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. Most muscle fibers have many mitochondria and produce ATP by aerobic respiration, which is good for prolonged activity such as distance running. Muscle fibers are red due to an abundance, of mitochondria. Not mitochondria, sorry. Muscle fibers are red due to an abundance of myoglobin, and a pigment related to hemoglobin is found in red blood cells. It stores oxygen in the muscle tissues. So the notes kind of talk about that we do anaerobic respiration as well, but it doesn't go into detail. So I've got a nice little graph here for lactic acid fermentation. So in glycolysis, where we're making 2 pyruvates, we're also making 2 ATP, but the cycle down in orange in the bottom here shows that glycolysis will fill up an NAD with an H. So in order to get rid of that hydrogen and make more NAD to keep the glycolysis process going, we make 2-lactate or lactic acid, and that's what your muscles burn, or makes your muscles burn, and we have to burn it off. So after you're done exercising, you're breathing in a lot of extra oxygen over and over to burn off that lactate or that lactic acid. Where was I? Energy from lipids or fats, also in animals, is used when blood glucose levels drop and fats are converted to organic molecules, which enters glycolysis and or the Krebs cycle. So I've got a little picture here, real briefly I wanted to show you. We've got myoglobin in muscle cells, and if you have red muscle, then you've got a lot of myoglobin, such as like in a steak. If you have kind of like a white muscle, like in fish, you don't have any myoglobin. And then chicken breasts are kind of white meat, but they're colored. They're not a true white like a salmon steak would be. Salmon slab, salmon fillet, there we go, fillet. So chicken is kind of in the middle with the amount of myoglobin that's present. And blood glucose is also a process. It goes through a cycle as well. And basically what happens is as you eat food, it will increase your blood sugar. We're starting on the right-hand side. It will cause your pancreatic cells to release insulin. Insulin will cause adipose cells to take up the glucose, so then fat cells will pull the glucose into them to store it for later, and then that decreases your blood sugar. The pancreas will release glucagon. Glucagon will cause the liver to break down glucose, which decreases your fat cells, and then it causes you to need to eat again. So this is the cycle that it was talking about, but basically your fats are stored in or fats store organic molecules, your fats do, and they can enter the Krebs cycle as needed. The last note is energy from proteins is obtained when during digestion proteins are split into their amino acid subunits and are absorbed into the bloodstream. So you've got some nice energy there in proteins, but it takes a little bit longer to break them down and a little bit more energy to break them down. But you still get some energy from proteins, but you have to absorb those into the bloodstream to make it happen. And then I just included a few notes on what happens and how it happens in your mitochondria. I've got a small picture there for the electron transport chain, showing how the NAD and FAD donate their hydrogen ions. And then I tried to put another picture, but I don't know how well it turned out, with your electron transport chain and it coming through your ATP synthase. So that's cellular respiration, fermentation, and energy burning in a nutshell. I hope that's helpful.